First, I want to express my deep and heartfelt appreciation for the honor of coming here in this moment after that warm greeting, that really rich cultural greeting, and to meet all of you. So thank you. As I'm going to talk today, I'm going to talk about this cluster of science that tells us how experience shapes human development over our life course and over generations. But I want to say that we live in an amazing time where we're bringing together ancient wisdom with fairly new science to understand much more deeply from every perspective, from our intellectual perspective, from our heart perspective, from our being on the earth perspective, how we're participating, how we're co-creating the future, and how the past is affecting that co-creation. So I'm going to talk about 4 kinds of science that I think of together, and we nickname near science: neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experience, and resilience. And when we're very first born, we don't even know we're separate from our mama or our parents, right? As we're conceived, we're totally one. And when we're born, we're tethered to mama. And in the very first period of time, we don't even know we're separate. Those of you who've raised little ones know that in the toddler years, that little one will fall and they'll look up to us and say, "Am I hurt? Am I okay?" Because they don't know till we say, right? "No, you're okay. We can stand again," right? And all of us as human beings have a brain and body that's going to adapt based on our experience. It's adapting biologically, it's adapting epigenetically, and in an ideal world, we would be with that connected person or persons, that group that are our people. And when there was a stressful moment that caused us to have that fight, flight, freeze response in our bodies, there would be someone nearby that could get us to safety within about 20 minutes at least, at the longest. And then what would they do? They would use some ancient techniques to help us calm. They would hold the head against the heart. They would rock. They might sing or chant or draw in a circle and be present with one another in ways that our people have used for thousands of years for calming. And in that way, we help the body learn through thousands of repetitions of, I can be on high alert and feeling there's danger, and I can calm. And all those repetitions allow us to calm fluently so that we don't even think about it. But actually, most of us don't have that childhood, at least not in this present time. And people who grow up with more danger, with danger that lasts a long period of time, or who have episodic danger where you never know where the next danger might be coming from, and so chemically, biochemically, we have to stay on high alert for a long period of time because we have to be ready for danger. Those people who grow up with a lot of danger in their childhoods, they have a brain that's preparing for the world that their body is anticipating that they live in. Actually, all of us have that kind of brain. But if we live in a world with danger, we're preparing for a world of danger. And we'll develop pretty typical characteristics. We might be hypervigilant, always ready for the next danger. We might be much more mission-focused and have a hard time picking up all the ancillary details and opportunities around us. We might have a hard time in a highly emotional state also being very rational and having a rational conversation. And we might be very quick to act, quick to get emotional and have a physical response to danger, and slow to shift gears and be able to soothe. And these characteristics are incredibly valuable because they keep the species alive. If we're going to live in a really dangerous world, it's probably not very functional to think for a long time when the predator is leaping at you, right? You don't want to. You want to sense the tiniest bit of danger at the very beginning of the danger and move before you even have to think. So these characteristics are incredibly valuable. And when we grow up in a very safe world, we're also going to have a brain and body that are adapting to the world we grow in, that are preparing for that anticipated world, and we'll develop pretty typical characteristics. We'll be very relationally oriented. We'll be the people who love that kind of chaotic brainstorming. If we were starting to brainstorm with 600 people in this room and it would get loud and noisy and buzzy, and if I said, move around to the next row and people started moving through the room, the people who grew up in a very safe world would just love it. They would thrive on that. They would love in a highly emotional state to be rational, talking things through. And you can imagine how these differences can kind of create some difficulties in relationships where in the height of an emotion, one person says, let's talk it through. And the other person says, wait, I'll need to go for a run for maybe 10 miles and then I'll be happy to talk it through, right? We're beginning to understand the biology, why we have these differences and what a gift it is that we do, because all of this preparation is preparation for the world we'll be living in. And the neuroscientist that I've done the most learning from, Dr. Martin Teicher, who is a rock star worldwide, Marty Teicher says it's not really which of these journeys that we go on during childhood that matters the most for well-being in our life. It's really whether there's a dissonance between how I prepared and come into the world as myself and what the world expects of me. If the world expects for me to be able to sit quietly and be rational while I'm in an emotional state, if we expect me to pick up all of the opportunities around me when I've grown up in a world of danger, then there's going to be a conflict that's hard on me and hard on everyone that relates to me, hard on the community, hard on the culture. And as we look at the neuroscience of how we're adapting, what we know is that our brains are wiring up, are connecting that complex neural network that allows us to do all the complexity of being human. That connecting is experience dependent. And so what fires together, wires together. What we experience is how our brains are developing mass and functioning, our abilities to be here in this human body, in this life. And what we know is that when we're very young, when the first few days of life, we have neurons, the brain cells, one of two kinds, neurons and glial cells. Our neurons are healthy and robust, but not very connected. And by about middle elementary age, we see this rich connection of neurons that's based on our experience growing up until that point. And then around puberty, we go through a period of time where our bodies are readjusting. Our bodies are noticing which of those neural pathways are used the most and most needed for the life we're going to live. And so we go through a period called pruning, where the pathways that have been most used stay robust, and the pathways least used go into the shadows. And we know we can pick them back up, but it's a lot of work when you're my age to pick up one of those neural network pathways that we haven't used much. But we know from stroke recovery we can do it. And how do we build or recover those neural pathways that we had when we were young but we didn't use very much? It's through thousands of repetitions. And so we'll talk about how we create the environments in which people have opportunity for growth and development throughout our lives. But we also first need to understand how powerful those developmental years are. Neuroscientists tell us that when our experiences occur in our childhood really matters, that there are sensitive developmental periods throughout childhood that are vital for particular brain regions. When we're first born, we don't have to be able to take a math exam or sing one of those beautiful songs that we heard this morning, right? We just need to be able to suck and swallow, regulate our body temperatures, hopefully sleep-wake state, although if you've ever taken care of a brand new newborn, you know that's not always the case. They may have a hard time with their sleeping and waking. And they rely on us, those people that they're interconnected with, to help them with that regulation. And in early childhood, we're developing more robust systems for that limbic system in our brain, the part of our brain that responds with fight, flight, freeze. And in that system, there are two regions of that system that are really important to understand. I'm going to give you a snippet, but we would love to be teaching you more if we have an opportunity to about this. So it's the hippocampus and the amygdala, and they work together as partners. The amygdala in the brain is what sends out the orders. You better deliver the cortisol, the adrenaline, those chemicals that make you ready to be swift and strong and respond to danger in an effective way. And then you have the hippocampus which registers all of the sensory information that's happening at that point of perceived danger and records it in your memory so that the next time you come up against any of that sensory information, the hippocampus can send a message to the amygdala and say, get ready, this is like that time before when there was danger. So the hippocampus is remembering in a sensory memory all of that. That's why you can walk into a room and have a smell and all of a sudden you feel that tension rise in your body. That hippocampus is remembering that smell perhaps, or the light, or the proprioception, your sense of balance or imbalance. All of the sensory input is being processed by the hippocampus so that it can send the message when you may be in danger and can give you that early warning system. But those earliest months are not the only sensitive developmental period. Also, in middle childhood, especially those of us who work in substance abuse treatment and prevention, we know that it is critical that we protect children in middle childhood and through the puberty years, because those are the times when brain regions most associated with mental health and difficulty processing the pleasure-reward system. Biologically, our pleasure anticipation, our pleasure reward is established in part through early childhood and then reinforced in middle childhood and puberty so that we have the right levels of dopamine and serotonin and the other chemicals that allow us to anticipate that I might have pleasure with you, that I can anticipate pleasure from running and dancing and singing, and that I don't need to regulate from something outside of us that might give me a false sense of security and well-being. By early adulthood, the amount of stress, the threshold of stress that it takes for me to be perceiving that I am in a crisis, a full-blown crisis, that tiger is jumping out at me from the woods. That stress threshold that tips me from I'm stressed to I am in crisis is largely set. And for people who have a lot of stress during their early childhood years, it's only a small amount of stress that is perceived then as a crisis. Now, this is really adaptive, right? Because if you live in a very dangerous world, you don't want to wait until you're right in the middle of a full-blown crisis, right? You want to perceive that smallest little hint, the rustle in the leaves that might mean there's a predator, or the flapping of the bird's wings as they light into the air so that we can notice when there might be danger. But the result is that people who have a lot of stress in their childhoods, that small amount of stress can tip them into crisis. And we've seen this one fact really be powerful with treatment and recovery groups when they realize that they might have a different stress threshold than each other and a different stress threshold than those people outside of the group, and that they can come to agreement that if I call you and I say, this is it, this is the crisis, you're not going to say, oh, I've been through that, that's not a crisis. You're going to say, it is a crisis to you, I'll be there. Because having people who show up and are present and are able to be calm and regulated while I'm in a crisis is absolutely vital for me to be able to be calm and regulated through that crisis. That ability to be one with one another and to co-regulate in our emotional states, so important. And so important for us to understand that we can't judge what someone else's threshold is for crisis. All we can do is appreciate when they're able to make a sentence about that we can show up. And it's been my experience working with communities over many, many years that making the sentence is often last. And so we're watching for body language, we're watching for inclination, we're watching for emotion, we're watching for those people who know me and can say, is that the threshold? Are you feeling that now? So that I can learn to make that language around my threshold. So that's a little snippet of the N, the neuroscience. I'm going to give you a little snippet of the E in near epigenetics. So epigenetics, a really new field. When the geneticists were tapping to figure out the genetic code, they thought once they understood that code that is in almost every cell of our body, once they understood that code, they would know everything about how Laura became Laura and Jean became Jean and on and on and on. But actually along the way, they found that that wasn't true, that experience is actually shaping how our genetic code is read and understood by our cells. In our cells, we have to keep in every cell, almost every cell of our body, a code that if we were to stretch it out, it would be more than 6 feet long. It has to organize itself inside that cell in a way that it doesn't get all tangled and that the cell can read sections of the code. And so it does that by wrapping itself around these protein balls called histones, which you see in the center of this slide. And experience can cause a chemical tag to attach to that section of the genetic code. And that chemical tag, many times is discussed as methylation, a methyl group attaching, but there are some other ways that it can happen. That chemical tag gives an instruction to that section of code. Should I stretch out so that section of code can be read by the cell? Or should I stay compacted so that that section can't be read? Now, this makes sense not only from an experience shaping those chemical tags, but also many of these tags come with us as we're born, not from experience, but just from the way our cells and our genetics work, right? For example, our genetic code tells us the sequencing of how our cells should specialize. So when we're first conceived, there's 1 cell, and then 2, and then 4, and then 16, and on and on. And over that course, what happens is our genetic code says you should be an eye cell, you should be a liver cell, you should be a skin cell. And we can imagine that if I'm an eye cell and you're a liver cell, we might need different directions in order to be able to do our jobs. So our genetic code is giving those specialized directions. But in addition to that, we also have experience giving directions to how the genetic code should be read. And geneticists are now understanding that some of those directions that come from my experience to my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, those can be heritable. They can be passed through these methyl tags. So I'd like to explain this by explaining a quick study. I'll give you a quick snapshot of a study that was done by scientists who were raising white lab rats, one of those classic lab experiments, where they caused the lab rats to become afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms. They used behavior modification to do that, so that when the waft of the cherry blossoms ran through the enclosure, those lab rats would respond in fear. They would huddle, the outer rats would protect the inner rats until the smell of cherry blossoms was removed from their environment. So imagine these lab rats, then they were moved to a different environment. There was never been any cherry blossom smell. They had pups. The rat pups grew up and they became adults. They're living separate from their parents. And they're living in a different environment that's never had any smell of cherry blossoms. And the scientists one day waft that smell of cherry blossoms into the enclosure with those rats. Pups, now adults. And what do you think those rat adults did? They were terrified. They ran to the corner. They huddled. The outer rats protected the inner rats. That smell of cherry blossoms signaled danger to them. Now, I can assure you there was no direct instruction, right? There was no white rat that walked to a whiteboard and wrote for these pups, you should be afraid of the smell of cherry blossom. No direct instruction. And so why would it be useful for a generation to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms based on what their grandparents or great-grandparents experienced? Survival, right? It's pretty handy if you're the baby rat and none of you has to die in order to know you should avoid something that's poison. Well, cherry blossom smell isn't poison, but these rats didn't know it, right? We're still passing this message. It is miraculous, I think, that we can pass a message from generation to generation through these epigenetic tags, that we should have caution in the midst of some experience. And epigeneticists are now understanding more and more about how these genetic messages are passed from generation to generation. And while we now understand why some whole groups of people might experience more depression, more anxiety, more fear, more caution in the midst of novel kinds of situations. We now understand that that can come from the history of one's people into one's life as we are conceived. But we also know from epigeneticists who are beginning to study, what about nurturing? Can nurturing, which also is essential for survival, right? Can nurturing, the ease of nurturing, be passed from generation to generation, and thereby parents who find it so difficult to parent today could pass to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren an ease in nurturing? And they think so. They think the reality that we co-create today can be passed in the form of these epigenetic messages forward through the generations that will come. And what epigeneticists say is this process is fluid, that we're changing these tags all the time. And so as we co-create the reality we want to stand with today, and we partner with parenting adults, with teens who will be the next parents, with this next generation of people coming into their adulthood with this amazing knowledge of wisdom, joining science, that we can co-create a different set of messages moving forward for the generations that will come. And when I talk to rooms with 600 parents where they're struggling, some of them, I'll say, wouldn't it be worth it to fake it if we had to for a generation, if we knew we were going to be able to pass that ease? And overwhelmingly, they'll say, yes, but I'm going to need some support. I don't know how to do it. And therein lies community, right? For centuries, for thousands of years, we've always turned to community to help parents know how to do this. So this takes me to the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Many of you probably know the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It's the largest epidemiological study of its kind. And epidemiological studies are done about the population. So the neuroscience and epigenetics that I just shared, that is studied by looking at individuals. But this study is about the population as a whole. And this ACE pyramid comes from the original concepts behind the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE. And the scientists who developed the study, Dr. Rob Anda, who was a senior scientist at the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, and Dr. Vincent Folletti, who was in charge of preventive health at a large HMO, a health maintenance organization, health center in San Diego, California. They both made some observations at that time, which led them to come together to build this study. At the time, they were both invested in prevention, and the prevention science worldwide was all about identifying risks and protective factors that led to disease, disability, and social problems and early death. And we were all about reducing risk in order that we reduce disease, disability, and social problems. But these scientists said, you know, I just can't line up all these facts. It can't only be about the risks, because risks are not random in the population. They're concentrated in some groups. And at the time, we didn't have the neuroscience or the epigenetic science that we have today to understand why adverse childhood experience might be such a powerful driver of social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, and how that functioning can drive risk and protection. But now we do know. And so this is an updated ACE pyramid that has the bottom layer on it. We know that historical trauma and intergenerational adversity increases risk for ACEs, which lead to these changes in the way we function as human beings, and that interaction with society that can add risk to our lives. So this is the hypothesis behind the ACE study. And the scientists engaged over 17,000 people in the study. These were fairly well-educated, employed, insured adults in a fairly wealthy part of the United States. So a lot of the social determinants of health were not as big an issue for this crowd. And so the scientists naively thought maybe they wouldn't see very many adverse childhood experiences. But that was wrong. In fact, ACEs are common even in this population. They're common across all socioeconomic boundaries. They're common across all ethnicity boundaries. They're common across the world. The scientists looked at 5 indicators of household functioning that they believed might be things that would cause a lot of stress for children. So they looked at having a parent who was abusing alcohol, drugs, or other substances. They looked at parental arguing and fighting and that sort of thing, but they used a proxy measure of separation and divorce. They looked at having a mentally ill, suicidal, or depressed person in your home while you were growing up. They looked at whether you witnessed violence against your mother. And later on, as we've looked at ACEs in other populations, we've looked at violence against any adult in the household. And they looked at criminal behavior, whether you had someone in the household who was sent to prison while you were a child. They asked about 2 kinds of neglect and 3 kinds of abuse. And the first thing that they found was among these 10 different categories of ACEs, each one of these categories was incredibly common. In fact, Dr. Rob Anda, who's my friend and business partner with the ACE Interface, was the first person to hold the data from these 17,000 plus people. And he said he was sitting at his computer, he was running the numbers, he had his own thoughts and biases about how rare these were. And when the numbers started coming into him and he saw how common they were, he rolled his chair back and wept. He had a hard time composing his emotion, holding it, because he is a doctor, and he thought, why didn't someone teach me this? I could have been so much better a doctor. ACEs are common, and it turns out that they're highly interrelated. Out of all the people in the original study that had one of those categories of adversity, 87% had more than one. And there wasn't any particular pattern or clustering. They come in all different kinds of clusters, but they generally come together. Where there's one, there are often many. And the ACE score then was a way that they could study the accumulation of many kinds of adversity during childhood. Before the ACE study, almost all the literature considered these separately. Having a parent with an addiction problem, a separate literature from having an incarcerated parent, a separate literature from witnessing or being exposed to violence in your home, and on and on. And these scientists said that doesn't make any sense to study it that way because they don't happen that way in people's lives. They pile up. And so they developed a simple way of studying the accumulation of different kinds of adversities, the ACE score. So the ACE score is simply a count of the number of different categories that one experienced during their developmental years. Now, really quickly, I want to say, for those of you who are counting up your ACE score right now, I have an ACE score of 5. If I tell you I have an ACE score of 5, you know nothing about my health and well-being because ACE score is not predictive at the individual level. If all of us have an ACE score of 5, that could predict something about the prevalence or how common it is for various challenges to appear in our lives. So if you're adding it up, let that go for a moment, and let me just show you a little bit about the study findings. ACEs are common across all different countries. We're much more alike than we are different. I'll send a PDF of these slides because you're going to try to track this quickly, and I'm going to move quickly through. But ACEs are common in all the countries where we've begun to gather this data. And the higher the ACE score, the larger the percentage in the population with a variety of problems. We call that the dose response or graded relationship. And so I'm going to show you a series of slides. And what I want you to notice is this stair-stepped pattern. These slides are all laid out, ACE scores along the bottom, and the height of the bars is the percentage of the population with the particular challenge that's on the title of the slide. So this is ACE score and smoking during 2009 after my state had invested millions and millions, hundreds of millions in helping people stop smoking. And we see almost a tripling of the risk between people with an ACE score of 0 and people with higher scores of 6, 7, or 8. And smoking tends to be started younger for people with a higher ACE score, continue throughout life, and lead to smoking-related disease. Adverse childhood experiences is also associated with alcohol dependence in our tribal cultures in the United States and probably our indigenous populations throughout the world because of colonization, because of genocide, because of ethnocide, and because of the ongoing policies that make life so difficult. This is a study by Drs. Koss and Palaka about adverse childhood exposures and alcohol dependence, where they were looking at how historical trauma might increase the odds of ACEs, which might increase alcohol dependence and on up. And what they found was that ACEs are common in this indigenous populations, in these tribes, and that 86% experienced 1 or more categories of ACE, and 33% reported 4 or more categories. They used a slightly different list of ACEs, including some of the colonization, the effects of colonization, and the abuses that occurred because of it in our country. And what they found is the higher the ACE score, the higher the percentage of the population with alcohol dependence. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leaders in trauma-informed care, says, self-regulation depends on having a friendly relationship with our bodies. Without it, we rely on external regulation, from medication, drugs, alcohol, to constant compliance with others, and on and on. And so I want to quickly show you how this regulation or dysregulation can manifest: difficulty sleeping, drinking alcohol prior to age 15, continuing to have problems with alcoholism or marrying somebody with an alcoholism problem, having a much higher percentage with illicit drug use, having illicit drug use in our middle childhood ages, and having continuing into our adult years. And so what helps people regulate? Bessel van der Kolk says we just have to remember two things. We put them together. We're going to engage socially at the same time we're calming the physical tensions in the body. Because remember at the beginning I said how we reestablish those neural networks that allow us to shift from relationship equals danger to relationship equals safety and healing. We need those thousands of repetitions where we experience relationship with calm and healing. And so as we put together those environments, they can be through simple things. They can be through walking and talking. They can be through dancing and drumming and being present with one another in ways that calm the tensions in the body. We see higher rates of anxiety among people with higher ACE scores, higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide attempt and suicide completion. And so I want to walk you through, as I'm concluding this talk, I'm going to walk you through what we can see from the progression of adversity that as it happens, at least in the US, and I would encourage you in New Zealand to start looking at your data in terms of can we see the unfolding of lives? Because when we can see the patterns, we can prevent at every turn along the way, right? We can stop the progression of adversity in people's lives. So we know that early trauma and stress leads to predictable patterns in brain development that can complicate our cognition in the top box, our sense of attention that can lead to ADD or ADDH-like symptoms. It can lead to behavior and relationship problems, and it can lead to having difficulty actually navigating the physical world, getting places on time, and without being injured. All of that leads to a risk for early substance use. And why is it that some people will take that first puff on a cigarette at maybe at age 11 or whenever it is they try, 9, whenever that is. And some people will say, ugh, and some people will say, ah. It's because ACEs lead to depression and anxiety and difficulty concentrating. And if you were to Google the positive effects of nicotine, you would find that they are a treatment for those problems. People are experiencing a treatment. But what's the problem with that treatment? It kills you. So what we're doing right now is understanding more about how are we adapting? And what are we using as our adaptive treatments? And can we help people choose something with less of a downside? We could go running. We could do drumming. We could do music, right? There's other ways to get a treatment that are much less damaging in people's lives. And all of that, at least in the United States, leads to more referral to special education, more difficulty in school, more dropping out of school, being kicked out of school, more social problems, and eventually delinquency and incarceration, which leads to these adult stressors. And these adult stressors are things that increase the odds of ACEs for the next generation. We're able now to track all of this progression of adversity across lives, which means all of us, not just the people that work in addiction and recovery, but the people that work in housing, the people that work in business development, and on and on and on, can have powerful roles stopping this progression of adversity across the generations. ACEs lead to co-occurring problems among people with high ACE scores. They're, on average, navigating 4.5 different kinds of health conditions. So life can feel harder because it is harder. Life is harder when you're navigating life with many different challenges associated with how you're regulating your body and your experience with illness and relationship and on and on. So among New Zealand children, we know from recent studies that have been done here, by age 4.5, half of the children have an ACE score of 1, and about 8-9% have an ACE score of 3 or more. And that ACE score is probably increasing over the next years of their life and having these profound impacts. But even at age 4.5, we see this dose-response relationship with difficulty being ready for school. ACEs are changing how we navigate life. But these same studies done here are saying, what are the critical protective factors? And interesting enough, they found that the quality of mother-partner relationship and the parents' health and wellness are vital factors for preventing kids from having those first ACEs and from having that pileup of ACEs. And so they're redirecting us, as we're seeing literature across the world, that we shouldn't just be thinking about the baby. We shouldn't just be thinking about mom. We shouldn't even just be thinking about baby and mom. That the way our lives really work is that our lives are nested. Those relationships, so powerful in our lives, are most successful when we're in a healthy relationship, when we're in healthy community, when we're in healthy culture, when we're healthy spirit and place. I'm going to skip these because I'm out of time. I'll come back to them maybe tomorrow. So I wanted to say that if you read across the literature, including the literature here from New Zealand, we find this framework that helps us understand what we have to co-create in order to help these next generations have more well-being. We have to build people's capabilities, but that is not enough. We have to build this environment, this cultural environment where we have a sense of attachment and belonging with one another, and where that attachment and belonging in the moments and weeks and months of earliest life doesn't get interrupted. We have to build the kind of environment where that attachment belonging is in the context of healthy community, culture, and spirituality. And the truth is, we can't do that without knowing the worldview of the people that we're relating with. And so we've got to slow down and learn, and that's why I felt so honored to be here at the opening of this conference today, to feel us all slowing down and learning about worldview and experiencing worldview, because as we do that, we have the power of shifting those messages that will translate into the future of health and well-being for all of the generations that come. Thank you.